November 12, 1945. A prisoner of war camp outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Margaret Fisher sat frozen at the long wooden table, her hands trembling in her lap. Before her, on a plain white ceramic plate, sat 3 thick slices of bread so white they seemed to glow in the pale morning light streaming through the mess hall windows. The bread was soft, pillowy, impossibly fresh. Steam still rose from its surface where it had been cut, releasing a yeast-sweet aroma that made her stomach clench with an emotion she couldn't immediately name. Around her, 43 other German women prisoners sat in similar states of shock, staring at their breakfast as if it might vanish if they blinked. Some had tears streaming down their faces. Others sat with mouths slightly open, breathing in the scent of real bread, white bread. Bread made from wheat flour instead of sawdust and chestnuts and whatever desperate substances had passed for food in Germany over the past 2 years. Margaret had not seen bread like this since 1942, perhaps even earlier. The memory felt like something from another lifetime, from a world that no longer existed. She reached out slowly, her fingertips barely touching the crust. It was real, warm, soft enough to compress slightly under the gentlest pressure. Her vision blurred with tears she hadn't given herself permission to shed. Across the table, young Helene Krauss had already picked up her first slice. The 19-year-old former nurse held it in both hands like something sacred, turning it slowly, examining it from every angle. When she finally took a bite, a small sob escaped her throat. She chewed slowly, reverently. Her eyes closed. Tears ran unchecked down her hollow cheeks. Captain Dorothy Hayes stood near the kitchen door, watching the scene unfold with growing confusion and concern. She had overseen dozens of POW facilities during her military career, had witnessed the processing of thousands of enemy prisoners. She had seen relief, gratitude, even joy. But she had never witnessed anything like this. These women were weeping over bread, plain white bread that the camp cook, Sergeant William Parker, had baked fresh that morning, using the same recipe he used every week. Sergeant Parker emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. He was a large man, barrel-chested, with the ruddy complexion of someone who had spent his youth working outdoors before the Army had made him a cook. He stopped next to Captain Hayes, following her gaze to the silent, weeping women. His expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of uncomfortable understanding. One of the guards, Private Eddie Morrison, leaned toward his fellow guard, Corporal Robert Chen, and whispered loud enough for the captain to hear. "What's wrong with them? It's just bread." But Margaret heard him, even through her tears. She looked up, meeting the young private's confused gaze across the room. In careful, halting English, she spoke the words that would later become the title of her memoir. "My children would never believe this." Hamburg, Germany, January 1944, 22 months before the bread. Margaret Fisher stood in line outside the ration office for the 3rd time that week, her ration cards clutched in her gloved hand. The temperature hovered just below freezing, and the line stretched around 2 city blocks. She had been waiting for 4 hours. Her daughter Lotta, age 7, and son Klaus, age 5, waited at home in their apartment, which was missing its western wall thanks to an Allied bombing raid 3 weeks earlier. They had stretched a tarpaulin across the opening, but the wind still found its way inside. The ration cards entitled them to 200 grams of bread per person per day. But the bread itself bore little resemblance to what Margaret remembered from before the war. The official recipe, published in newspapers to help housewives understand what they were receiving, listed the ingredients as 50% rye flour, 20% sliced sugar beets, 20% tree flour made from ground beechwood and straw, and 10% minced leaves and weeds. The resulting loaf was dense, gray, and tasted of bitterness and desperation. Margaret's husband Ernst had died 2 years earlier on the Eastern Front. His death notice had arrived on official Wehrmacht stationery, expressing the fatherland's gratitude for his sacrifice. It did not mention that he had frozen to death in a trench outside Stalingrad. It did not mention anything useful at all. What it did do was reduce the household's ration allocation. A widow and 2 small children received less than a family with a serving soldier. She had been a teacher before the war, instructing children in literature and history at a gymnasium in Hamburg's Rotherbaum district. The school no longer existed. A direct hit during a 1943 bombing raid had reduced it to rubble. Now she worked 12-hour shifts at a factory that produced electrical components for U-boats, her educated hands learning to solder wires and assemble circuit boards in freezing warehouses. When she finally reached the front of the line, the ration clerk, an exhausted woman in her 60s, stamped her cards and handed over a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. Margaret could feel through the wrapping that the loaf was smaller than it should have been. She didn't complain. Complaining accomplished nothing except attracting unwanted attention. That night, she divided the loaf into 3 portions, giving her children slightly larger pieces than her own. Lotta ate hers slowly, trying to make it last. Klaus, too young to understand rationing as anything other than permanent hunger, asked for more. Margaret gave him half of her own portion, pretending she wasn't hungry. She lay awake that night, listening to her children's breathing in the darkness, calculating how many more days the remaining rations would last. She thought about real bread, white bread, the kind her mother used to make on Sunday mornings before the war. The memory was so vivid she could almost smell it. Almost. September 19, 1945. A displaced persons processing center outside Bremen. Margaret stood with 200 other German women in a bombed-out factory courtyard, waiting to be sorted and classified by Allied authorities. The war had officially ended 4 months earlier, but the chaos of its aftermath continued to reshape lives and destinies with bureaucratic randomness. She had been arrested 3 weeks earlier, swept up in a mass detention of women who had worked in war production facilities. The distinction between forced laborers and willing participants mattered little to the Allied processors. Everyone associated with Wehrmacht production was being detained, questioned, and categorized. The American sergeant processing her intake form had asked his questions in broken German, writing down her answers in careful block letters. Age, 34. Occupation, factory worker, formerly teacher. Marital status, widow. Children, 2, currently with maternal grandmother in Hamburg. Affiliations? None, she insisted, though the sergeant looked skeptical. Everyone claimed no affiliations now that the Reich had fallen. She had been separated from Lotta and Klaus 6 weeks earlier, when British authorities had ordered the evacuation of her damaged apartment building. Her mother had taken the children to her sister's farm in the countryside, where food was allegedly more available. Margaret had promised to follow within days. Instead, she had been arrested, processed, and now stood waiting to learn her fate among strangers who shared only their common status as defeated enemies. The crossing to America took 17 days aboard a converted Liberty ship. Margaret shared a hold with 63 other women sleeping on metal bunks stacked 3 high. The ship rolled constantly in the autumn Atlantic swells. Most of the women were seasick for the first week. The American sailors brought them meals twice daily. Simple food, but more abundant than anything Margaret had eaten in years. Boiled potatoes, canned vegetables, occasionally tinned meat. But it was the hardtack biscuits distributed at breakfast that caught her attention. They were nothing like real bread, just flour and water baked until hard enough to break teeth. Yet they were made from wheat flour, real wheat, without sawdust or tree bark. She saved one biscuit, wrapping it carefully in a piece of cloth, thinking she might somehow send it to her children as proof that such things still existed in the world. During the crossing, the women rarely spoke to each other. What was there to say? They were prisoners of former enemies, being transported to an unknown fate in a foreign land, separated from whatever family they had left. Margaret spent hours on deck when permitted, watching the endless gray ocean, trying not to think about how far she was traveling from Lotte and Klaus. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the morning fog, several women crowded the rail to see it. Margareta stayed below, unwilling to witness symbols of American triumph. November 11, 1945, Lancaster POW Camp, Pennsylvania. The day before the bread. The transport truck had arrived at the camp after midnight. Margaret and the other women had been processed in a blur of paperwork, medical examinations, and barked instructions in English that most of them didn't understand. They had been issued plain gray work dresses, assigned bunks in a long wooden barracks, and told that orientation would begin in the morning. Margaret had collapsed onto her bunk without bothering to undress, exhausted beyond the capacity for thought. She woke to the sound of a bell ringing somewhere outside. The barracks. Pale dawn light filtered through the high windows. Around her, other women stirred slowly, confused and disoriented. An American female guard, a stern-looking woman in her 40s, entered and announced something in English. When no one moved, she repeated it louder, then made eating gestures with her hands. Breakfast. They filed out into the cold November morning, following the guard across a muddy compound yard toward a large building that smelled of cooking. Margaret's stomach clenched at the scent. She couldn't identify what was being prepared, but it smelled like real food, not the watery soups and ersatz coffee that had sustained her for years. The mess hall was warm, heated by radiators along the walls. Long wooden tables were arranged in rows, each set with plain white plates and metal utensils. The women shuffled in, uncertain where to sit or what to do. Captain Dorothy Hayes stood near the entrance, watching them with an expression that Margaret couldn't read. Not hostile, but not friendly either. Watchful. Sergeant William Parker and two other cooks emerged from the kitchen carrying large trays. They moved along the tables, placing food on each plate. Margaret watched, disbelieving, as a generous portion of scrambled eggs appeared on her plate, followed by 2 strips of bacon, and then 3 slices of bread so white they looked like they belonged in a painting rather than on a prisoner's breakfast plate. She stared at the food, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be for them. There had to be some mistake. Around her, other women were having the same reaction, frozen in place, afraid to touch the impossible feast before them. Young Helene Krauss, sitting 2 seats down, whispered in German, "Is this a test? Are they seeing if we'll take it?" Frida Bachmann, the oldest among them at 52, shook her head slowly. "I don't understand," she murmured. "We are prisoners. Why would they feed prisoners like this?" Margaret reached out, her hand shaking, and touched the bread. Margaret Fisher had been born in Hamburg in 1911, the daughter of a textile merchant and a piano teacher. She had grown up in a comfortable apartment overlooking the Ulster, attended good schools, and married Ernst Fischer in 1936 when she was 25 and he was 27. He had been an accountant with a quiet disposition and a love of classical music. They had been happy in the unremarkable way of people who fit comfortably together. Lotte arrived in 1938, Klaus in 1940. By then, the war had already begun, though Hamburg itself remained largely untouched during those early years. Ernst received his conscription notice in March 1941. He reported for duty with the resigned acceptance of a man who understood that individual preferences mattered nothing against the machinery of the state. He kissed Margaret goodbye at the train station, held his children close, and promised to write. He kept that promise for 18 months until the letters stopped coming in November 1942. The official notification of his death arrived 3 weeks later. Margaret read it alone in their apartment while the children slept. She did not cry. Crying accomplished nothing. Instead, she folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and began calculating how she would keep her family alive on a widow's ration. The bombing of Hamburg began in earnest in July 1943. The British called it Operation Gomorrah. Margaret called it the end of the world she had known. For 8 days and 7 nights, bombers appeared overhead in waves, dropping incendiaries and high explosives until entire neighborhoods burned in firestorms that consumed oxygen and people with equal indifference. 42,000 people died. Her apartment building survived, though damaged. Her parents did not. They died together, in a public shelter that took a direct hit. After the bombing, Margareta was assigned to factory work. The Reich needed workers to replace the men dying on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. She worked 12-hour shifts, came home to her children, divided whatever rations she had managed to obtain, and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. She taught Lotta to read using charred books salvaged from the rubble. She told Klaus stories about his father, editing out the parts about war and death, creating a mythology of a hero who would someday return. But Ernst would not return. Margareta knew this with absolute certainty. The dead did not come back, no matter how much children wished otherwise. What mattered was survival, getting through each day, protecting Lotta and Klaus from the worst of the hunger and fear and destruction. She became efficient at this, hardening herself against emotion, making decisions based on pragmatic calculation rather than feeling. When the British soldiers came to evacuate her building in August 1945, she sent her children to her mother's sister in the countryside. When American authorities arrested her for war work 3 weeks later, she did not protest. When they transported her across an ocean to an unknown fate, she accepted it with the same resignation Ernst had shown at the train station. But now she sat in an American prison camp, staring at white bread, and all the careful numbness she had cultivated was cracking apart. She thought of Lotta and Klaus, probably eating watery potato soup in her aunt's farmhouse. She thought of the gray sawdust bread they would divide carefully to make it last. And she looked at the impossible abundance before her and began to cry. Captain Dorothy Hayes had served in the Women's Army Corps since 1943. She had overseen logistics operations in England, managed supply depots in France after D-Day, and processed thousands of displaced persons through temporary camps across liberated Europe. She considered herself unshockable, a woman who had seen enough of war's aftermath to be surprised by nothing. But watching 44 German women weep over breakfast bread challenged that assumption. She approached the nearest table slowly, trying to understand what she was witnessing. The women weren't eating. They were touching the bread with trembling fingers, holding it to their faces, inhaling its scent. Some were praying. Others simply sat with tears streaming down their faces, making no effort to wipe them away. One woman, the older prisoner with gray-streaked hair, had broken off a small piece of bread and was holding it in her palm, staring at it as if it might dissolve. Sergeant William Parker stood beside her, equally confused. "Captain, did we do something wrong? Is there something wrong with the bread?" His voice carried genuine concern. Parker took pride in his cooking, had been feeding soldiers for 3 years, and had never seen anyone cry over his food except in appreciation. "I don't think it's the bread, Sergeant," Hayes said quietly. "I think it's what the bread represents." She had read the intake reports on these women. Most had been arrested in occupied Germany, classified as war workers, and transported to the United States for detention, until final decisions could be made about their status. The reports listed their names, ages, and work histories. What they didn't capture was the context of their lives, the circumstances that would make white bread worth weeping over. Corporal Robert Chen, standing guard near the door, had been listening. His parents had immigrated to San Francisco from Guangdong Province in 1922. He had grown up hearing stories about hunger in China, about years when rice was more valuable than gold. He recognized what he was seeing. "Captain," he said softly, "I don't think they've seen real food in a long time." Private Eddie Morrison, barely 20 years old, and fresh from Iowa farmland, looked skeptical. "But it's just bread. We had this for breakfast every day growing up. Sometimes we fed it to the chickens if it got stale." The statement, innocent in its ignorance, seemed to echo through the hall. Margaret heard it. She looked up at the young private, her face wet with tears, and spoke in her careful English. "In Hamburg, last winter, the bread ration was 200 grams per day. The bread was made from sawdust and tree bark. My children were always hungry, always." She paused, struggling with the words. "This bread, this real bread. My children have never tasted this. They would not believe it exists." The room had gone silent. Every woman was listening, even those who didn't speak English. They understood the tone, if not the words. Private Morrison's face had gone pale. He looked at the bread on the nearest plate, seeing it differently now, not as commonplace food, but as impossible luxury. Sergeant Parker cleared his throat. "Roughly. How long, he asked. "How long since you had real bread?" Frida Bachmann answered in heavily accented English. 3 years? Maybe 4, I cannot remember." That evening, after the women had been shown to their work assignments and given the basic rules of camp life, Margaret sat on her bunk with a piece of paper and a pencil that Captain Hayes had provided. Each prisoner was permitted to write 1 letter per week to be reviewed by camp censors before mailing. The letters would be sent through the International Red Cross, which would attempt to deliver them to family members in occupied Germany, though delivery was not guaranteed. Margaret stared at the blank page for 20 minutes, trying to decide what to write. How could she explain to Lotta and Klaus, if this letter ever reached them, what had happened to her? How could she describe being transported across an ocean to become a prisoner in a land they had been taught to think of as the enemy? More impossibly, how could she tell them about the bread? She began writing in German, knowing the censors would need it translated, but unable to compose complex thoughts in her limited English. "My dear children," she wrote, then stopped. The pencil trembled in her hand. She started again. "I am safe and being treated well. I think of you every moment. I hope you are with Grandmother Anna and that you have enough to eat." The lie in that last sentence caught in her throat. Of course they didn't have enough to eat. No one in Germany had enough to eat. Hunger was so universal, it had become the normal state of existence. She crossed out the sentence and tried again. "I hope you are healthy and that the farm has food for you." She wanted to tell them about the breakfast, about the white bread and the eggs and the bacon. She wanted to describe the warmth of the mess hall, the kindness in Sergeant Parker's confused face when he saw them crying, the way Captain Hayes had quietly ordered the guards to give them time before requiring them to work. But how could she write such things? How could she tell her hungry children that their mother, a prisoner of war, was eating better than they were? Young Helene Krauss sat on the next bunk, also attempting to write a letter. She was trying to reach her parents in Berlin, though she had no idea if they were alive or if their house still stood. "What are you writing?" she asked Margaret in German. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "How do we tell them the truth? That we are prisoners who eat like royalty while they starve?" Anna Weber, a mother of 3 from Berlin, overheard them. She had already crumpled up 2 attempts at writing to her children. "We cannot tell them. They would think we were lying. Or worse, they would think we had betrayed Germany to earn such treatment." Her voice was bitter. "Better to say nothing about the food. Better to just say we are safe." But Margaret found she couldn't stay silent about the bread. She wrote, carefully, "Today I had real white bread for the first time in years. It made me think of Sunday mornings before the war, when Grandmother used to bake. I know this sounds strange, but I wanted you to know that such bread still exists somewhere in the world. Someday, when this is all over, we will have it again together." She sealed the letter, knowing the censors would read it, knowing it might never reach Hamburg, knowing that, even if it did, her children might not understand what she was trying to say. But she had to try to capture this moment, this impossible morning when white bread had broken through years of carefully constructed numbness and made her feel something again. Sergeant William Parker had learned to bake bread from his father, who had learned from his father, in an unbroken line stretching back to their family's arrival in Pennsylvania in 1873. The Parker family had farmed 80 acres outside Lancaster for 3 generations, growing wheat and corn, raising dairy cows, and baking their own bread every week. William had joined the Army in 1942, and his skill with ovens had quickly made him more valuable in kitchens than in combat. He had baked bread for soldiers in training camps across the United States. He had baked bread for officers and enlisted men, for the wounded in hospital wards, for prisoners of war in a dozen different facilities. He had never given much thought to the act beyond the technical requirements of flour, water, yeast, and heat. Bread was bread. You mixed it, kneaded it, let it rise, baked it, and served it. Simple. But watching those German women weep over his breakfast bread had shaken something loose in his understanding. He couldn't stop thinking about what Margaret had said. Her children had never tasted white bread. The concept seemed impossible to him. Growing up as he had, with abundance so common, it was unremarkable. His family had sometimes fed day-old bread to livestock. These women treated fresh bread like precious metal. That afternoon, while the prisoners were being assigned to various work details around the camp, Parker went to Captain Hayes with a request. "Ma'am, I'd like permission to increase bread production. I've been making 6 loaves per day for the camp. I'd like to make 12. Hayes looked up from her paperwork, surprised. "We don't have the personnel to justify doubling our bread ration, Sergeant. What's this about?" Parker shifted his weight, uncomfortable with explaining emotions he barely understood himself. "Those women this morning, ma'am. I've been thinking about what they said, about their children, about the sawdust bread." He paused. "My father always said that bread was meant to be shared, not rationed. I have the flour, I have the time. I'd like to make sure those prisoners get real bread every day they're here, as much as they want." Hayes studied him for a long moment. William Parker was a practical man, not given to sentiment or unnecessary gestures. If he was asking for this, he had his reasons. "The extra flour will come out of your general supplies budget," she said finally, "and the prisoners are not to receive preferential treatment over American personnel." "Understood, ma'am. Everyone eats the same. I just want to make sure there's enough that no one goes without." That evening, Parker stayed late in the kitchen, preparing dough for the next morning's baking. He worked the mixture with his hands, feeling the gluten develop under his palms, thinking about the women who would eat this bread. He thought about his own mother, who had died when he was 12. She had baked bread every Saturday morning, filling their farmhouse with yeast-sweet warmth. He wondered what she would have said about women who wept over bread. Corporal Chen found him there past midnight, still working. "Sergeant, you planning to sleep tonight?" Parker looked up from the dough he was shaping into loaves. "In a bit. Want to make sure. This is right." He couldn't explain why it mattered so much that the bread be perfect, why he was taking extra care with the shaping and the proofing. He just knew that tomorrow morning, when those women sat down to breakfast, he wanted them to have the best bread he could make. The second morning's breakfast brought the same emotional response, though slightly muted by familiarity. The women still handled the bread with reverence, but now some of them were actually eating it, taking small bites and chewing slowly, making each mouthful last. Margaret sat with Helene and Anna, the 3 of them having formed an unspoken alliance based on shared circumstance and compatible temperaments. Anna broke her bread into small pieces, eating them one at a time with long pauses between. "My mother made challah every Friday," she said quietly in German. "Before the war. The whole apartment would smell of it. My children would wait by the oven, fighting over who got the first slice." Her eyes were distant, remembering. "The last time I made it was 1941. After that, we couldn't get eggs or enough flour." Helene, the youngest among them, had fewer memories of abundance. She had been only 14 when the war started, and her teenage years had been defined by rationing and shortage. "I don't really remember bread being different," she admitted. "I mean, I know it was better before, but I can't quite remember what it tasted like. This bread seems like something from a storybook." Margaret thought about her own memories. Sunday mornings in her mother's kitchen, the ritual of fresh bread with butter and jam, teaching Lotte to knead dough when she was only 4 years old, the little girl standing on a stool to reach the counter. The last loaf she had baked in her own oven had been in early 1943, before the rationing became severe enough that baking at home was impossible. She had used their entire week's flour ration for that single loaf, a small act of defiance against the grinding deprivation. Frida Bachmann, sitting across from them, overheard their conversation. "I worked in a bakery before the war," she said, "in Berlin. We made 20 different types of bread, rye bread, pumpernickel, sourdough, sweet rolls, everything. I knew the smell of fresh bread so well, I stopped noticing it. Now I cannot stop smelling this American bread. It is all I can think about." Other women joined the conversation, sharing their own memories of bread and food and the gradual erosion of normal life. Greta Hoffman remembered her wedding in 1939, when there was still enough sugar for a proper cake. Another woman described the last Christmas before rationing, when her family had eaten roasted goose and potatoes with real butter. Each memory was a small window into lives that had been dismantled piece by piece. The sharing of these stories created something unexpected in the mess hall. What had been a collection of frightened, isolated individuals began to feel like a community. The women discovered they had more than imprisonment in common. They shared memories of a world that had existed before hunger became constant, before every meal required careful calculation and compromise. Sergeant Parker, serving more bread from a fresh batch, paused at their table. He didn't speak German, but he understood the tone of their conversation. Remembering, mourning, connecting. He set down an extra loaf in the center of their table, unasked for, and moved on without comment. Margaret looked at the extra bread, this gift from their captor, and felt the careful walls she had built around her emotions continue to crumble. By the end of the first week, the women had settled into the camp's routine. They woke at 6 each morning to the sound of the bell. They washed in the communal facilities, dressed in their plain gray work clothes, and walked to the mess hall for breakfast. And every morning there was fresh bread. White, soft, warm bread in quantities that seemed to defy logic or fairness. Margaret had been assigned to work in the camp's administration building, filing papers and organizing records under Lieutenant James Thornton's supervision. Her ability to read and write English, though limited, made her valuable for clerical work. She found the work easier than factory labor, though the warmth of the heated office sometimes made her feel guilty. Other women worked in the laundry, the kitchen, the maintenance shed, or the camp gardens. But regardless of their assignments, all of them returned 3 times daily to the mess hall, where Sergeant Parker's bread appeared with predictable abundance. Lunch brought sandwiches made with the same white bread. Dinner often included rolls or toast. The consistency of this abundance began to work its way into their understanding of their new reality. Anna Weber was the first to articulate what others were beginning to feel. "I keep waiting for it to stop," she said, during their third breakfast. "I keep thinking tomorrow there will be no bread, or it will be rationed, or they will tell us it was a mistake. But it keeps coming." Helene nodded. "It feels wrong to trust it. Like trusting it means we have forgotten what is real." She paused, struggling with the contradiction. "But it is real. This bread is more real than anything we had in Germany for the past 3 years." This was the central tension the women wrestled with. Accepting the abundance meant acknowledging how complete their deprivation had been. It meant admitting that their own government had failed them in fundamental ways, while their supposed enemies were treating them better than their own country had. The implications were disturbing and complex. Frida Bachmann, the former bakery worker, had begun helping Sergeant Parker in the kitchen during her free time. She claimed it was to keep her hands busy, but everyone knew she was drawn to the bread itself, to the familiar alchemy of flour and water becoming something sustaining. Parker, initially skeptical of having a German prisoner in his kitchen, had discovered that Frida knew techniques he had never learned. She taught him how to create a crispier crust using steam. He showed her the American method of enriching dough with milk and butter. Their wordless collaboration, communicating through gestures and the shared language of baking, became a small symbol of unexpected bridges being built. One afternoon, Frida shaped a batch of rolls into the traditional German Kaiser shape, the 5-fold pattern she had made thousands of times in her Berlin bakery. Parker watched, fascinated, then tried to copy her technique. His first attempts were clumsy, but Frida patiently corrected his hand positions until he got it right. That evening, the mess hall served Kaiser rolls at dinner. The German women recognized them immediately. Several began to cry again, but this time the tears felt different. Not shock or grief, but something closer to gratitude. December 3, 1945. 3 weeks after the first bread, the International Red Cross delivery arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. Captain Hayes called an assembly in the mess hall to distribute the letters and packages that had made their way through the chaotic postal systems of occupied Germany. Of the 44 women in the camp, 19 received mail, 25 did not. Margaret's name was called. Her hands shook as she accepted the thin envelope, recognizing her aunt's handwriting immediately. She sat at one of the long tables, afraid to open it, afraid of what news it might contain. Around her, other women were experiencing their own moments of reckoning with whatever word had reached them from home. She opened the envelope carefully and unfolded 2 pages of cramped handwriting dated November 5th. Her aunt wrote in the economical style of someone accustomed to paper shortage. "Dear Margaret, the children are with me and are safe. Lotta asks for you every day. Klaus has forgotten much but still mentions Mama sometimes. Food situation here is very bad. The farm has potatoes, but little else. I give the children what I can. They are thinner but alive." Margaret read the words again, trying to extract more information than the sparse sentences provided. Thinner but alive. What did thinner mean? How hungry were they? The letter continued with practical details about the farm, about neighbors who had died or disappeared, about the British occupation authorities who came weekly to inventory food stores. Then, near the end, "Your letter arrived last week. Lotta read the part about white bread many times. She asked if you were making up stories like you used to tell them before bed. I did not know how to answer. Is there truly white bread where you are? It seems impossible." Across the table, Anna Weber was weeping silently over her own letter. Helene sat frozen, staring at a page without reading it. Frida had received nothing and sat with her hands folded, her face carefully blank. Anna looked up, her eyes red. "My children are in a displaced persons camp near Frankfurt. My mother is dead. My husband is missing, probably dead. My oldest son, 14 years old, is working for the British occupation in exchange for food." She laughed bitterly. "He sorts rubble, a child sorting rubble for bread rations." The contrast between their current circumstances and what their families endured was unbearable. Here they sat in a warm building, having eaten eggs and bread and coffee for breakfast. Real coffee, not the ersatz brew made from roasted barley. Meanwhile, their children sorted rubble, grew thinner, asked questions about white bread as if it were fairy tale magic. Greta Hoffman spoke what others were thinking. "How can we sit here eating while they starve? What right do we have to this comfort?" Captain Hayes, who had been observing from near the door, stepped forward. "You have the right, because you are here and they are not. Your suffering will not feed them. Your guilt will not make their bread appear." Her voice was firm, but not unkind. "The question is what you do with the strength you gain from eating." But her logic, sound as it was, did nothing to ease the moral weight pressing down on them. The letters from home created a rift among the prisoners. Some, like Margaret, continued to eat the bread but carried visible guilt with every bite. Others began refusing portions, pushing their plates away, insisting they could not accept abundance while their families starved. A third group argued that wasting food was its own sin, that throwing away bread honored no one. Anna Weber stopped eating breakfast entirely for 3 days. She attended meals, sat at her usual place, but left her plate untouched. On the third morning, Sergeant Parker noticed and brought the matter to Captain Hayes. "The prisoner in Block 2, the woman from Berlin. She's not eating. Should I be concerned?" Hayes approached Anna during lunch. "Mrs. Weber, I understand you're upset about the letters from home, but starving yourself helps no one." Anna looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Captain, my son is 14. He sorts rubble for bread. How can I eat eggs and fresh rolls knowing that? By staying alive and healthy so that when this is over, when you can return to him, you will be strong enough to help rebuild his life." Hayes paused. "Your suffering here changes nothing for him, but your survival might change everything for his future." The argument made logical sense, but failed to address the emotional reality. Anna began eating again, but minimally, taking only enough to avoid medical intervention. Other women followed her example, creating an unspoken hierarchy of guilt based on how much comfort they permitted themselves. Frida Bachmann, still working in the kitchen with Sergeant Parker, found herself caught in the middle. She loved the bread, loved the craft of making it, loved the temporary escape that working with dough provided. But other prisoners began commenting on her kitchen time with pointed remarks about collaboration and forgetting where she came from. One evening, Margaret found Frida sitting alone in the barracks, crying quietly. "They think I have forgotten," Frida said. "They think because I helped the American sergeant with his baking, I do not care about Germany, about the people starving there." She wiped her eyes roughly. "But I think about them every moment. Every loaf I shape, I think about the people who have no bread." Margaret sat beside her. "Then why do you keep baking?" "Because it is the only thing I know how to do that makes something good instead of destroying. I spent 2 years in a factory making artillery shells, shells that killed people. Now I make bread, bread that feeds people. Even if it only feeds our captors and us prisoners, it is still better than making weapons." The conversation revealed the complexity of their situation. They were prisoners of war, but they were also women trying to find meaning and purpose in circumstances they had not chosen. The bread had become more than food. It was a symbol of moral questions they had no clear way to answer. Private Morrison, overhearing some of the tension, asked Corporal Chen if he understood what was happening. Chen, whose immigrant parents had navigated their own complicated relationship with their adopted country, explained, "They feel guilty for being treated well. In their minds, accepting kindness from us means betraying their families. It is not logical, but guilt rarely is." November 28, 1945, Thanksgiving Day in America. The German women had no context for the American holiday. Captain Hayes attempted to explain it during morning assembly, describing the historical narrative of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing a harvest feast. The women listened politely, but without comprehension. Another American celebration, another reminder that they were in a foreign land with foreign customs. What they could not have anticipated was the scale of the meal Sergeant Parker and his kitchen staff had prepared. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys and autumn leaves cut from colored paper. The tables were set with extra care, and when the food began arriving, the prisoners simply stared in disbelief. Roasted turkey, carved into thick slices, mashed potatoes with gravy, sweet potatoes topped with something sticky and sweet, green beans, cranberry sauce, stuffing made with bread, herbs, and butter, and pie. 3 different kinds of pie made with real sugar and real fruit. Margaret sat at her assigned table, looking at the heaping plate before her, and felt something break inside her chest. It was too much. It was grotesquely too much. While her children ate watery potato soup on her aunt's farm, she sat before a feast that could have fed her entire extended family for a week. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I cannot," she said in English, loud enough for the room to hear. I cannot eat this while my children starve." Other women nodded, several standing in solidarity. Captain Hayes stepped forward, but it was Sergeant Parker who spoke first. His voice was gentle but firm. "Ma'am, with respect, your children aren't starving because you're eating. They're starving because of a war that destroyed half of Europe. You didn't start that war. You didn't choose to be here, and refusing this food won't put a single bite in their mouths." "But it feels wrong," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "I know it does." Parker looked around at all the women, many of whom were crying now. "My grandmother came to this country with nothing. She told me stories about being so hungry in Ireland that people ate grass. She said that when she finally had enough food, she felt guilty every day for years, guilty that she had escaped while others suffered." He paused, measuring his next words carefully. "She also said that honoring the hungry means using your strength to build something better. Starving yourself just means there are more hungry people in the world. It helps no one." Mrs. Ruth Henderson, the church volunteer who had been permitted to attend the Thanksgiving meal, added her voice. "My ladies, I have been visiting this camp for 3 weeks now. I have watched you receive terrible news from home with dignity. I have watched you work hard at your assignments. I have watched you support each other through grief." She smiled sadly. "Today, let yourselves be fed. Tomorrow, we can talk about how to help those still suffering." The Thanksgiving meal continued in subdued fashion. The women ate, but without joy, their guilt seasoning every bite. Sergeant Parker watched from the kitchen doorway, troubled by what he had witnessed. He had meant the feast as a gesture of shared humanity, a way to show these prisoners that Americans were not the monsters German propaganda had portrayed. Instead, he had created a spectacle of uncomfortable abundance. After the meal, as prisoners filed out, Parker began cleaning the kitchen alone. He scraped uneaten food into waste bins, troubled by how much remained. Frida appeared in the doorway, hesitant. "Sergeant Parker, may I help clean?" He nodded, grateful for the company, even if conversation would be limited by language barriers. They worked in silence for several minutes before Parker spoke. "My grandmother, the one I mentioned earlier, she came from County Cork in 1848. He wasn't sure why he was sharing this. Frida probably understood only fragments of his English, but Frida was listening intently, picking up enough words to follow. Parker continued, speaking as much to himself as to her. "The potato famine, millions starving. She was 16 when she left Ireland, watched her younger brother die of hunger the month before she sailed. She made it to Pennsylvania with nothing but the clothes she wore." He paused, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary force. "She married my grandfather, had 6 children, built a good life. But she never wasted food, never. Even when we had plenty, she saved every scrap. My father said she would wake up at night sometimes, checking the pantry to make sure the food was still there." Frida understood trauma. She understood survival. She spoke carefully in her broken English. "She afraid the hunger comes back." Yes, even 40 years later, even with a farm full of food, she was afraid. Parker set down the pot, looking at Frida directly. "She told me once that the worst part wasn't the hunger itself. It was feeling helpless, watching people suffer, and being unable to help." He gestured vaguely toward the mess hall. "That's what I saw in your faces today. Not just guilt. Helplessness. You can't feed your children from here, and it's eating you alive." Frida nodded slowly. She wiped her hands on a towel, thinking. Then she said something in German, realized Parker couldn't understand, and tried again in English. "Your grandmother? She find peace?" Parker considered the question. "I think so, eventually. She started helping other immigrants who came after her. She couldn't save everyone, but she could help the ones in front of her. That seemed to give her purpose." The parallel was clear. Frida looked around the kitchen at the ovens and the flour bins and the tools of bread making. "Maybe we cannot help our families now, but we can help here." Parker smiled slightly. "That's what I've been trying to say, but you said it better." They continued cleaning in comfortable silence. two people from different worlds finding common ground in shared understanding of hunger, loss, and the small redemptions possible in daily work. The conversation between Parker and Frida marked a subtle shift in the camp's atmosphere. Word spread among the prisoners about the sergeant's grandmother, about her journey from starvation to abundance, about her struggle with survivor's guilt. The story resonated because it gave them a framework for understanding their own complicated feelings. They were not betraying their families by eating. They were surviving so they could someday help rebuild. Margaret found herself spending more time in the kitchen, translating between Frida and Sergeant Parker as they exchanged baking techniques. Parker taught them the American method of quick breads made with baking powder. Frida demonstrated German sourdough techniques passed down through generations. Anna Weber, tentatively joining them, shared memories of her mother's challah recipe, working from memory to recreate the braided loaves. Captain Hayes noticed the kitchen had become an unofficial gathering place, and rather than discouraging it, quietly approved expanded access. The women were learning English through practical application. They were developing skills that might serve them after the war. Most importantly, they were finding purpose in creation rather than dwelling in guilt. One afternoon, Margaret worked alongside Parker to make dinner rolls. As she shaped the dough, Parker asked her about her children through simplified English and hand gestures. She pulled out the photograph she carried everywhere, creased and worn. Lotta and Klaus, taken in 1943 before everything became desperate. "Your daughter, she looks like you," Parker observed. "How old?" 7 years, Margaret said. "No, 8 now. She has birthday in October." The realization that she had missed Lotta's birthday hit her with fresh grief. She had been on the ship during her daughter's 8th birthday, crossing an ocean, unable to even send a card. Parker was quiet for a moment, then disappeared into his small office. He returned with paper and colored pencils. "Write her. Tell her what you're learning. When you go home, you can teach her to make bread like this." The suggestion was simple but profound. It reframed her time here not as abandonment of her children, but as preparation for reunion. She could learn things here, develop skills, and bring them home as gifts. The bread she made today could become bread she would someday make with Lotta and Klaus. That evening, Margaret wrote a different kind of letter. She described the kitchen, the techniques she was learning, the way dough felt when it was properly kneaded. She drew simple diagrams showing how to shape rolls. She made promises about future baking sessions they would share. The letter transformed her captivity into education, her guilt into hope. Other women began similar projects. Helene, who had been helping in the medical office, wrote detailed descriptions of basic nursing care to her younger sister. Anna documented American hospital procedures, thinking she might help improve German medical facilities when she returned. Greta sketched the camp's efficient organizational systems, imagining how such methods might help rebuild German communities. They were still prisoners. They still carried grief and guilt. But they were also students, learning from their captors in ways that might someday benefit those they loved. January 1946, 2 months of white bread. The war had ended 8 months earlier, but the logistics of repatriation remained complicated. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Transportation was limited. Displaced persons camps overflowed with refugees, former prisoners, and orphans. The American military had no clear timeline for when the women prisoners at Lancaster would be sent home. Captain Hayes called an assembly to provide what information she had. The War Department estimates repatriation processing will begin in March, possibly April. You will be transported to displacement camps in Germany, then released to return to your families. She paused. "I know this is later than you hoped. I know the wait is difficult." For Poole, Margaret, the delay brought mixed feelings. She desperately wanted to see Lotta and Klaus, to hold them, to verify with her own eyes that they were surviving. But she had also come to value the strange safety of the camp, The predictable meals, the warmth, the absence of bombs and starvation. Returning to Germany meant returning to devastation. That evening, the women gathered in the common room of their barracks for what had become a nightly ritual. They shared letters from home, taught each other English phrases, and talked about their plans for the future. The conversations had evolved from mere survival to genuine hope. Anna spoke about wanting to open a small medical clinic in her neighborhood when she returned to Berlin. Frida dreamed of reopening a bakery, perhaps teaching young people the craft. Helene, only 20 now, talked about finishing her nursing education. Greta wanted to work in reconstruction administration, helping organize the rebuilding efforts. Margaret shared her own emerging vision. I want to teach again, not just school subjects, but practical things: cooking, nutrition, health, things that help families survive and rebuild. She looked around at her fellow prisoners. We have learned so much here, not just skills, but different ways of thinking about problems. We can bring that home. Mrs. Henderson, visiting that evening with supplies donated by her church, listened to their plans with approval. You women have transformed yourselves from defeated enemies into potential leaders. That's remarkable, she smiled. I hope you'll remember that when you face the difficulties waiting in Germany, remember that you have skills and knowledge and strength. But remembering the bread, the kindness, the transformation would be complicated. How would they explain to other Germans that American captivity had been better than German freedom? How would they describe abundance in a land they had been taught to hate? Would anyone believe them? Would they be accused of collaboration or weakness? Frida voiced the concern. When we return, will they call us traitors for accepting American kindness, for learning from our enemies, for eating their bread while our people starved? The question hung heavy in the room. They had no answer. March 27, 1946, Repatriation Day. The transport trucks arrived at dawn. 44 German women prisoners gathered in the compound yard with their meager belongings, preparing to begin the long journey back to a homeland most of them barely recognized anymore. They wore the same gray dresses they had arrived in, supplemented now with donated coats and scarves from local church groups. Each carried a small parcel of personal items and letters from home. Captain Hayes conducted the final roll call, her voice steady but tinged with emotion she rarely showed. Over 5 months, these prisoners had become something more than enemy detainees. They had become individuals with stories, with families, with dreams for futures that seemed impossibly fragile. Ladies, you will be transported to New York, then to ships bound for Bremen. From there, you will be processed through displacement camps before release. Margareta stood in formation, her throat tight. She had written final letters to Lotta and Klaus, telling them she was coming home, though she had no idea if the letters would arrive before she did. She had packed the photographs Parker had taken of her in the kitchen, evidence of this strange chapter in her life. She had carefully folded the recipes she had copied, written in both German and English. Sergeant Parker emerged from the kitchen building carrying wooden crates. He set them down near the trucks, then gestured for the women to approach. "For your journey," he said simply. Each crate contained fresh bread, wrapped carefully in cloth, loaves of white bread, Kaiser rolls, even some sweet rolls made with precious sugar and cinnamon. The gesture broke the formal military atmosphere. Several women began crying. Frida approached Parker and spoke in careful English. "Sergeant, we cannot thank you enough. You teach us more than bread making. You teach us kindness exists." Parker, uncomfortable with emotion, shrugged. "You taught me something too. Taught me not to take food for granted. Taught me that bread can mean more than just filling stomachs." He paused. "When you get home, when you bake bread for your families, I hope you'll remember that enemies can become friends." Anna Weber stepped forward with a small package. Inside was a carefully embroidered handkerchief created during evening hours in the barracks. The stitching depicted wheat stalks and the words "Mit Dankbarkeit," with gratitude. "From all of us," she said, So you remember us too. The loading of the trucks took longer than scheduled because Captain Hayes permitted extended farewells. Private Morrison shook hands with women he had guarded for months. Corporal Chen exchanged addresses with Helene, promising to help her practice English through letters. Mrs. Henderson embraced Margaret, making her promise to write when she was reunited with her children. As the trucks pulled away from the camp, Margaret looked back at the mess hall, where she had first encountered white bread, where she had wept over the impossible abundance, where she had slowly learned to accept kindness from former enemies. The building grew smaller in the distance, but she knew the memory would remain vivid forever. She held the wrapped bread in her lap, already planning how she would share it with Lotta and Klaus when she finally reached them. May 1971, 25 years after the bread. Margaret Fisher Henderson stood in the kitchen of her small restaurant in Hamburg, preparing dough for the next morning's bread service. Her establishment, called simply Bread and Peace, had opened in 1953 and had become a neighborhood institution. She baked traditional German breads alongside American-style white loaves, her menu reflecting the dual identity she had developed across 2 continents. The restaurant door opened, triggering the small bell she had installed. Margaret looked up from her work and froze. Standing in the doorway, older and grayer, but unmistakably himself, was Sergeant William Parker. "I hope you still remember an old army cook," he said, smiling. Margaret's hands, still covered in flour, went to her mouth. "Sergeant Parker, I cannot believe you are here." She came around the counter, embracing him without hesitation. "How did you find me?" "Your letters to Mrs. Henderson. She kept them all, showed them to me over the years. When I retired last month, I decided it was time to see what became of the women who cried over my bread." They sat at a corner table, and Margaret brought coffee and fresh rolls. Parker looked around the restaurant with approval. "You did it. You brought the bread home." "I brought more than bread," Margaret said. "I brought the lesson you taught me. That food is not just sustenance. It is connection, memory, hope." She gestured to the kitchen. "My daughter Lotta works with me now. My son Klaus is a teacher. They grew up hearing stories about the American camp, about the sergeant who baked bread with kindness." Parker pulled out a worn photograph. The picture showed Margaret in the Lancaster camp kitchen, shaping dough, her face concentrated and peaceful. "I kept this, reminded me that even in the worst circumstances, people can find moments of grace." Margaret showed him her own treasured photograph. Lotta and Klaus, now adults with children of their own, standing in front of the restaurant. "The day we opened, I baked white bread using your recipe. My children tasted it and finally understood the stories I had been telling them. They cried, just as I cried that first morning." They talked for hours, sharing the decades that had passed since their last meeting. Parker told her about his farm in Pennsylvania, about continuing to bake bread in retirement, about never forgetting the German women who had taught him that abundance is not neutral, that kindness matters, that small gestures can carry weight beyond measure. Margaret shared her journey home to devastated Hamburg, the reunion with her skeletal children, the years of rebuilding. She described how the bread-making skills she learned in captivity had literally fed her family during the hardest reconstruction years, how she had used American techniques to stretch limited ingredients further than traditional methods allowed. "You saved more than just me," she said quietly. "You saved my children by teaching me to make the most of whatever flour we could find. You saved my spirit by showing me that the world still contained kindness." As evening fell over Hamburg, Margaret walked Parker through her neighborhood, pointing out the rebuilt buildings, the children playing in parks that had been rubble fields. They passed families gathering for dinner, the warm smell of baking bread drifting from apartment windows. "This is what your bread became," Margaret said. "Not just the recipe, but the lesson. That even enemies can break bread together. That kindness transcends nations. That white bread in the hands of a generous cook can change the world one loaf at a time."